Hello and good afternoon, everyone. I'm starting our time together with my land acknowledgement as a settler on Turtle Island. Right now in the space I'm on, it's the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, including the Chippewa Nation, the Haudenosaunee, also known as the Iroquois, which include the Oneida Nation, the Lenape, also known as the Delaware, and the Ottawatomie, known as the Neutral, and the Wendat, known as the Huron people. In this space, I acknowledge the privilege I have of being the Executive Director of Advocacy for the Gender Equality Coalition of Ontario. This means that I experience a great amount of power along with a great amount of responsibility. I participate actively in this acknowledgement of the land to ground me in the rest of the work for the rest of my day. Today is important for me to center the land as a means to ground myself for the content of my work and our gathering here today. When I feel connected and centered, I feel more open and prepared to listen wholeheartedly. Today, I'm thankful for the land for many reasons, but recently, with all that has been happening in the world, I'm even more aware of how important it is to care for the land on which we live. These past few years have been difficult for all of us, and it can feel like too much. But when I ground myself, I feel hope. The agreement in which the land we stand, or I stand, is Treaty 6, established in 1796. Reminding myself of the history helps me contextualize what it means to be a Londoner. It gives me space and pause to think about the impacts of colonization in the community, which was in the space long before the city limits. And I ask you from wherever you're at to ground yourself and acknowledge the land and those that have stewarded the land from the beginning. It is an unfortunate truth of our country that to the date, there has been found over 9,864 children. They were found in unmarked graves. And it is with the deepest pain that we know there's still many to be found. In my province of Ontario, one of the resource richest of provinces in the country, 65 of the 207 First Nations communities have a boil water advisory today. I finally want to acknowledge the work of the Gender Equality Coalition and the work of all of us. Welcome and miigwech. So today we want to start in a good way. We want to address the issue and not the person. We want to lean into discomfort. We want to be respectful of others on their terms. We want to expect and accept non-closure. Acknowledge we are all on a journey and part of the journey is growth. We want to show up with humility and empathy, even if opinions differ. We want to be patient and accountable to one another to ultimately build trust with one another. And confidentially, we need to know what is said here stays here. Gender Equality Coalition of Ontario is all about gender justice and intentionally including those that haven't always been part of this conversation. So I want to welcome you all. Amanda and Jeff.
Thanks so much, Danny, for the warm welcome and for the land acknowledgement. And I'd just like to begin by saying thank you to Danny and Linda, who are the executive directors of the Gender Equality Coalition of Ontario, for inviting Jeff and I to present today. And thank you to the United Nations for allowing us to be a parallel event here today. And thank you to all of you who've taken time from your March break holiday to join in and learn about gender inequality and how men can wade into the waters. So I'm Dr. Amanda Zavits. I'm a professor of sociology and women's studies at Fanshawe College and Western University, and I'm also the chair of the Gender Equality Coalition of Ontario. Thank you for coming and welcome.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jeff Perera. I've been speaking and writing about helpful versus harmful ideas of manhood and men helping end gender-based violence since 2008. And as settlers here on traditional lands, very thankful for the wisdom, brilliance, and just learning from Indigenous women that we've had over the years, and very thankful to be here with you all. And for anyone joining us from around the world, welcome from Canada, a land of over 8,000 rivers and 2 million lakes. They say there are few better ways to witness the natural wonders of the land of endless lakes and rivers called Canada than by kayaking through its waters. Thousands of years ago, the Inuit created kayaking as a way to travel, explore, hunt, and further connection with both the land and to other Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island, what is also called North America. Did you know that 71% of the Earth's surface is covered by water? The oceans hold about 96.5% of our water, but water is everywhere. It's in the air vapors that we breathe. It's in the clouds that we gaze at. It is in the soil beneath our feet, and it flows within us. The average human body is made of 57 to 60% water.
We often think of the journey of life like flowing down a river, or even in terms of the ebbs and flows of the ocean. Water is unpredictable. Water availability is becoming less predictable in many places around the world, and increased as incidences of flooding tends to threaten and destroy water points and sanitation facilities and contaminate water sources. In some regions, droughts are exacerbating water scarcity and thereby negatively impacting people's health and productivity. Water sustains us, but in excess, like in the times of a flood or a hurricane, it can also be damaging. Like everything in life, the only thing we know for sure is that water flows. It moves through the cracks and crevices of life, and it's constantly changing. It's truly unpredictable. Water can come in many shapes and forms. It can be turbulent, it can come in waves, or it can be still, like the glass of a beautiful lake on a sunny morning. When you think of a body of water, whether it's a lake, a pond, a puddle, or even your bathtub, things often float to the surface once the waters have been calmed. We want you to think about gender inequality like the body of a water. We traditionally understand the history of the feminist movement in terms of waves, but we can also understand what's happening in terms of the women's movement in the forms of currents, or like the analogy of the body of a water. We've come a long way, but in 2022, it's clear more than ever that we have much further work to do. We need to bring everyone into the water so that today's waves of feminism and the waves of change in general have the deeper impact we all need. We truly need to bring everyone into the waters and do the work we need, because it will have a ripple effect.
We hope to convey to you today is that we need a true ripple effect in the feminist movement, and that ripple effect includes all of you, regardless of your race, gender, sex orientation, or ability. When we change the relationship we have with our ideas of gender, it changes the relationship we have with one another. We need to move from harmful to helpful ideas of femininity and masculinity, and this means realigning our relationships as men, women, and gender diverse people within our own selves first, which then ripples out to our relationships with others that we know and even those we don't know, and even our relationship with the earth itself. We need to be in community with each other and our lands. One of the other things that water may bring to the surface is difficult or uncomfortable truths. One uncomfortable truth is that the women's movement has always struggled to be equal or inclusive. Historically, the women's movement has been about some women getting privilege at the expense of other women and some men. Here's another uncomfortable truth. We all need water to survive. In fact, we can only survive 3 days without water. We can survive several weeks without food, but water is essential to our survival on Earth. That being said, we don't have equal access to water. For some people, access to water is a simple turn or a twist of the tap. For others, water is contaminated. And for others still, water is within a 5-kilometer walking distance. We have 7 billion people on our planet, yet 2.3 billion people do not have access to clean drinking water or basic sanitation. We might ask ourselves, how is this possible?
That's a great question, Jeff, but I have an even better question. How is it possible to talk about gender equality, equity, or justice when some people don't even have access to basic necessities of life, such as clean drinking water or basic sanitation, or even safety? We need to be really clear here. Almost half the world lives on less than $2 a day. 80% of the people on our planet live where the income gap is getting bigger rather than smaller. On a global perspective, women and girls bear the brunt of economic poverty. The richest 1% of the global population earn more than 50% of all the income earned. The poorest 50% earn a total of 8% of global income. Here's the very hard truth. The COVID pandemic has brought it home to us. Economic inequality doesn't just create immense suffering, it contributes to the death of one person every 4 seconds. Inequality is not an abstract issue. It has real and devastating consequences for people around the world. The hard reality is that it's not by chance, it's by choice. The world's small elite billionaires, we're talking about 2,755 people, individuals, have seen their fortunes grow during the global pandemic, more during the combined time of the global pandemic than it has in the last 14 years combined. The cost of inequality is human lives. It directly contributes to the deaths of around 21,000 people per day. That's one person every 4 seconds. These deaths result from hunger, lack of access to healthcare, climate breakdown in poor countries, gender-based violence rooted in sexist economic systems. Inequality is deadly for our future, for all of us. The influence of the top 1% on the rest of us is major. We all lose when the top 1% use double the carbon emissions of the bottom 50% combined. Extreme global inequality is not a sign of a healthy economy. It's a sign of a profoundly harmful and violent economic structure. The fact that people in poverty, women, girls, and racialized groups are disproportionately harmed is not an accident. Extreme inequality is a form of economic violence that is perpetuated by systemic policy choices that are made by the most powerful people in the world. This causes direct harm to all of us. The solution is for all of us to be invested. We all have to wade into the waters together. As we move throughout our presentation, you will see that the solution lies in shifting our consciousness. We like to imagine that these problems are far away, that only people in underdeveloped countries lack access to clean drinking water or safe living conditions. Unfortunately, this is not the case. In Canada, one of the richest countries around the world, where we're convinced that we have freedom, democracy, equality, and multiculturalism, the very people who walked on this land first are forced to drink contaminated water. At any given moment, there are more than 100 drinking water advisories in place for First Nations people across Canada. And these statistics are according to our own federal government. How do these ideas around access to water relate to gender equality? Well, they're related because what many people fail to understand is that gender inequality is just another form of inequality. It's yet another barrier. Unless we all come together to dismantle the barriers, until we all work together to face some of those hard truths that are surfacing, there will continue to be people on our planet who lack access to clean drinking water. There will continue to be people in our own backyards who lack access to clean drinking water. And there will continue to be people who suffer more than others. This is how it's designed to be. This is inequality. This is hierarchical ranking. In real life, this is what it means when some people benefit at the expense of others. What we hope to convey to you today is that gender inequality is a form of inequality, and all types of inequality are social structural. They serve to maintain the stratification hierarchy, or the way that people are ranked hierarchically in Canada. We think we have equality here, but the reality is that some people are more equal than others. The reality is that inequality is highly political. It's in the vested interest of those people in positions of power to maintain the structure of inequality because it allows them to maintain their positions of power.
In our conversation today, we will not only look at the waves of feminism from the past leading us to the waters that we are in today, but also look at the kind of direction, the flow that we need to move towards true positive social change. At this moment in history, we need to look deeply at our collective reflection in the water. We need to take a look around us and see who is in the water, who needs to wade in and join us, who is missing, and why, and how we get moving together in a good direction. In 2022, the goals of the Gender Equality Commission on the Status of Women align with the goals of sustainable development. The goal is to achieve economic empowerment for women and girls. On one hand, we can see how far we've come, how deep we have gone in the waters, but we need to realize how far we still have to go. At times like these, when countries are waging war on others, when innocent humans are being killed and displaced, when human rights are being violated, it might feel to many of us like we are drowning. At times like these, it may feel as though the land is not even in view on the horizon. It isn't necessarily only women and girls who need economic empowerment. In today's advanced global capitalist and neoliberal society, we want you to see that economic empowerment for the few comes at the expense of the many. We indeed have a long way to go, but we need to get there together. To get to a destination, you need a vehicle. For traveling across large waters between us and our destination, you need a vehicle like a large boat or a ship. Now, a vehicle is made of many parts. from the hull to the anchor, to the deck, to the propeller, to the bow, and so on. Each part has its own role or task, but contributes to the overall function of the vehicle. The collective efforts of people and organizations worldwide towards gender justice and change are like the different parts of the ship. We all have unique and vital roles to play, all contributing to the larger effort. Some get more recognition, some are perceived as more important, while others have roles that are devalued and not appreciated. Some organizations or people have to carry a larger burden or load and don't get enough support. For some, the vehicle towards change may feel like it's becoming or has already become stuck in the water. Some may feel as though the vehicle has slowed down or even shifted in the current. And sometimes it may even seem like the boat is taking on water. Many individuals or organizations feel like they're paddling upstream. We need more people contributing to and supporting all the unique roles and tasks that make up the vehicle. Getting more people to contribute to the effort means getting more people in the water to begin with. This is the only way to get the ripple effect we need, the ripple effect we want. We need to understand that we cannot affect positive social change until more people are willing to cross their divides of differences and work together. Amanda and I are hoping to emulate this today. We want to model the way that we see forward. We want to be what we want to see. Together, we hope to show you that it can look like when two people from very different backgrounds or walks of life come together to work collaboratively to foster and promote positive social change. Now, part of the solution is honest and really clear conversations about the ripple effect that we have had and the reasons many are not in the water or missing from the waves of feminism. We have to model what we ask of others and look at ourselves, our own reflection, and model what it means to make change as individuals before we can truly start moving in a good direction. Navigating the waters of the pandemic has meant the waters women and gender diverse people swim in have become even more treacherous and more dangerous than ever. The acceleration of hate, further reach of male supremacy movements, and far-right ideologies has meant a direct threat to women's rights and bodies, the existence of LGBTQIA people, as well as the threat to the humanity and emotional, mental, and physical health of men and boys. So we need to have brave, self-reflective conversations together, asking ourselves important questions like, who is in the water? Why aren't some people in the water with us? Why does feminism have such negative connotations? How do we have proactive approaches towards solutions to these issues? How do we get privileged people, privileged elements of progressive movements to awaken from the complacency that they've been happy to just sit in and float in? These are just some of the questions that we hope to discuss in our presentation today. This wave of feminism can be defined by the deeper, personal, collective cross-investment of all women, men, and gender diverse people in being together in the water and invested in being part of the wave. We can counter the perception that this wave is about the cancellation of men, so-called call-out, cancel culture, and other misconceptions. We can model embracing accountability and taking responsibility and recognizing this is the day of our awakening and not the day of our reckoning. To realize and achieve goals like economic inclusion and ending gender-based violence, transphobia, and homophobia. Transforming our patriarchal culture requires revitalized and renewed investment and commitment. It requires us to invest commitment and dive deeper in today's wave of feminism. So we're gonna throw a poll up for everyone here and get that going. And the first question we're sharing with you all is, do you consider yourself a feminist? Who here already identifies as a feminist? So you can click your answer there. And we appreciate you participating.
Linda, we can't see the poll results.
So we're at 74% 84% of participants. Do you want me to end the poll?
Sure.
Okay.
Okay. Wow,
Right.
that's impressive. So it looks like 87% of you already identify as feminists. That's interesting. So we're going to ask the question at the end of the presentation and see if we've shifted or changed anyone's mind. Before we do that, we want to talk about some of the complications associated with feminism and the history of feminism. So I want you to think about, what do you know about feminism? Beyond the fact that we've had 3 waves of feminism, what do you think when you hear the word feminism? So just take a quick moment and type in the chat box. When you hear the word feminism, what kind of things do you think about? And make sure everyone can see your answers. Okay, that's good. Some of you are my students. So you're saying equality for all. Some of you are saying equality. Some of you are saying work equality. Okay, I like that Hillary says pro-woman. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute. Supporting women, really good. Wanting equal representation, equal rights. Okay. Great. I can see equality, equal pay, economic and political equality, really good. Oh, I love the answer from Jan, intersectionality. That's something we're going to talk a lot about in today's presentation. Gender and sex, thanks, Bronwyn. Oh, strong parents, I like that, Norma from London. Okay, so a lot of thoughts on feminism. One of the things that we'd like to talk to you about today is the state of feminism. Maybe all of you are in this talk for a particular reason, and you already have a pretty good understanding of what feminism is. But for many people around the world, feminism is a bad word. It has negative connotations, even among those with the best intentions. For many, many people, the word feminism brings up images of bitchy women, of women who are lesbian or women who burn their bras and march in the streets. The word feminism brings up negative connotations of women who dislike men or women who blame men for the problems of their world. From old school images like Rosie the Riveter to newer school representations of feminism that are more diverse, images of feminism in the media tell us that feminism is all about fighting. It's about defending, it's about standing up to authority. As the Me Too movement barrels forward and records of number of women seek office, and as the march of women drives the resistance against conservative political administrations, feminism is reaching a new level of cultural relevance, one that it hasn't had in years. It's now a major object of cultural discourse. And this has led to some very confusing conversations because not everyone's familiar with or agrees with basic terminologies of feminism. So I guess the question is, are those aggressive images and messages about feminism true? My answer is yes and no. They're true in that some women have marched in the street and others have burned their bras. Some feminists are lesbian, some are corporate leaders, and others are stay-at-home moms. What these people have in common is that most feminists are women. Women have had to fight for the rights they have today. Women haven't always been defined as persons. Believe it or not, women were not allowed to be educated. Scientists argued that they could not be educated or should not be educated because it would move too much energy from their uteruses to their brain and make them too feeble to bear children. Women were not allowed to open their own bank accounts without their husband's or father's signature. For all these reasons and more, women have historically been economically dependent on their male counterparts. Today, much has changed. In our presentation, we will argue that we have come a long way in terms of achieving gender equality in the Canadian context. However, we will also argue that there's a long way to go. In other words, we haven't come as far as we might like to think, and this is especially true in the global context. Part of the reason that it's so difficult to decide whether a person is a feminist or not is because there's been so much controversy and disagreement within the feminist movement itself. There's been a long history that involves women oppressing other women. There's been a long history that can be best understood by looking at the different types of feminism. So I'm going to walk you through those different types now. Liberal feminists wanted to change within the existing structures of capitalism and patriarchy. During the first wave of feminism, women who were white, middle class, fought for individual access to institutions. This was also known as the suffragette movement. Canadian feminists in this era included Henrietta Edwards, Nellie McClung, Louise McKinley, Emily Murphy, and Irene Parlby. You might recognize these women as the famous five. The second wave of feminism was also referred to as the women's liberation movement. And similar to the first wave of feminism, it was also led by white, middle class, and upper class women. In the first wave of feminism, women had gained access. The second wave of feminism was about fighting for rights in public institutions like politics, the workplace, and education. Women had gained access to be in public spaces, but the second wave of feminism was about fighting to be treated equally within those spaces. One of the most famous works to define the second wave of feminism was Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique. Betty Friedan is famous for describing the problem with no name. Friedan argued that women were quietly discontent in their roles of as housewives and wives and mothers. And Friedan wanted to liberate these women from these confined spaces. As we'll learn in the presentation today, the assumption that paid work would liberate women is implicitly biased for many reasons. Even so, there were many differences among second wave feminists. Socialist feminists or Marxist feminists disagreed with liberal feminists that liberation or equality could be achieved within the confines of capitalism. In fact, they think we need to overthrow capitalism and believe that true equality cannot occur so long as individuals are exploited by the economic structures of capitalism and private property ownership. Remember, if you're not my student, capitalism is an economic structure whereby profit maximization is the ultimate goal. From a Marxist feminist perspective, true equality cannot be achieved unless all humans are equal, not on the basis of gender, but despite gender differences. Unlike Marxist feminists who are critical of capitalism, radical feminists want to overthrow patriarchy. Patriarchy is a social system where men hold primary power and predominate in roles of political leadership, moral authority, social privilege, and control over property. Radical feminists believe that so long as there are structures in our society that continue to be male-dominated, we will continue to have inequality. So you see the difference between radical feminists and social feminists. There's another type of feminists that became popular in the second wave of feminism, and they were referred to as ecofeminists. Ecofeminism is a branch of feminism that examines the connection between the oppression of women and nature. Ecofeminists put forth the idea that life in nature is maintained through cooperation, mutual care, and love. And it's an academic and activist movement where the primary aim is to address and eliminate all forms of domination while recognizing and embracing interdependence and connections that humans have with the earth. So we're going to do another quick poll now. We're going to talk about the third wave of feminism next, but before we do so, I want you to tell us, which feminism do you most identify with? Which do you most agree with? Liberal feminism, radical feminism, socialist feminism, ecofeminism, or none of the above?
Just past 50% now.
Okay, we'll give it one more minute. Okay, close the poll, please. Okay, so lots of differentiation here. And actually that's what I was kind of hoping that I would get, because what I want you to see is that even within the feminist movement, people can't agree with the type of feminism. So there's a lot of divide even within the feminist movement itself. So I'm really happy we kind of got those poll results. The main criticism of these waves of feminism is that they are essentialist. So for those of you who don't know, essentialism means that we believe that there are inherent differences between men and women, and we recognize these differences by calling for there to be two separate categories that are treated equally. Okay, so from my perspective, essentialist thinking is problematic because it's binary. We come to understand one thing in opposition to the other. And if we believe that masculine and feminine or male and female are essential, then this denotes or makes it seem as though it's biological. So we'll get to that in a minute. But what I want you to see at this point is that the problem with these types of feminisms that we've talked about is that they're essential, or they're essentialist in their thinking. The bigger problem with the various types of second wave feminism is that they were exclusive. In general, the second wave of feminism was exclusionary and focused centrally on the needs and goals of white, middle, and upper class women like Betty Friedan, who had the privilege to be arguing that men and women ought to be treated equally in the workforce. This is a major problem. Third wave feminists, also known as postmodern feminism, was founded in the 1980s by Rebecca Walker, who is the daughter of Alice Walker, in Miss Magazine, where she famously declared the entrance into third wave feminism. Third wave feminists wanted to move beyond the critiques of the second wave of feminism. So the second wave of feminism was highly critiqued for being too foundational, too white, and too middle class. The movement was critiqued for not taking marginalized people or their stories into account. The goal of postmodern and third wave feminism was to move beyond these binary or vast generalization, this categorization of men versus women. The major component of third wave feminism is academic and investigates queer theory. Sociologists and women's studies professors like me called on societies and communities to recognize that gender and sex are not two distinct or essential social categories. Instead, they're fluid. They're categories that are fluid, and we need to move beyond a binary understanding of male versus female, masculine versus feminine. And this is true progress. We need to move beyond these binary conceptualizations. In fact, we need to dismantle the entire construction of sex, gender, and sexuality. The most important contributions of third wave feminism is the idea of intersectionality. So I was really happy when I saw some of you type in intersectionality into the chat box. Intersectionality has us understand that race, ethnicity, class, religion, gender, sex, ability, and nationality are all significant factors when discussing feminism. It examines issues related to women's lives on a global and international basis. Third wave feminists focused on LGBTQ+ rights, body positivity, fat positivity, sex positivity, environmentalism, and even the brain beauty stigma. Activists in this wave realized that many communities were left behind during the second wave of feminism, and the third wave of feminism was their opportunity to bring these peripheral communities to the forefront of activism. In the third wave of feminism, there was increased understanding of bisexual and trans identities. The main point is that the emphasis here was on micro-politics and the ways that sexism and misogyny can be challenged in everyday rhetoric, television, film, literature, and to some extent on social media. In fact, our main criticism of the third wave of feminism is that it's too micro, too individualistic, that because it's so narrowly focused, it removes attention away from the social structures of inequality that are embedded into our institutions and society. Now, whether or not we are in the fourth wave of feminism is up for debate. Some feminists argue that we are currently in the fourth wave of feminism. Other people argue that the fourth wave of feminism is still to come. If we are indeed in the fourth wave of feminism, then fourth wave feminists are known for enacting the concepts of third wave feminism. So the ideas that were put in place by third wave feminism are being acted out in the fourth wave. People like Pythia P. first declared the existence of the fourth wave of feminism way back in 2005. And other feminists such as Jennifer Bogartner in 2011 have told us that the fourth wave of feminism has already been in play since about 2008. The fourth wave of feminism, if we are in it, represents things like reproductive justice, plus size fashion, abortion talk lines, transgender support, and male feminism. These are all shown in the realm of feminizing and the racialization of the feminist movement in social media campaigns like blogs and Twitter.
Technology is also allowing women to build stronger, more widespread and reactive online movements. Some people are arguing that the rise of technology and the internet itself represents the fourth wave of feminism, and that this has been the impetus for what we are now calling as call-out culture, where people are called out or challenged on their negative behaviors, attitudes, impact, and actions. Some people also argue that this fourth wave was driven by the development of technology, social media, and open communication. The internet provides tools to empower women. Many of the female activists push for more female leaders, business people, women in politics, and other male-dominated fields. Not only does the influx of information provide women with the tools to break through glass ceilings, these women are focused on revealing maltreatment to the light. The Me Too movement has surfaced numerous stories and experiences women have had of harassment, assault, and violence that were previously urged, forced, and blackmailed to keep quiet. Social media provides a sense of mobility that allows women from all over to gather on certain platforms to provide support to one another, trade stories to empower others in those situations. There's no doubt that social media has its place within our society, and it can be used as a positive tool to promote social change.
As a sociologist, I applaud these efforts, but I also question the extent to which call-out culture perpetuates identity politics, where people come to define themselves in opposition to one another. Identity politics is reinforced by ideas of difference. Identity politics is the tendency for people in particular religions, ethnic groups, races, sexual orientations, abilities, or genders to form exclusive political allegiance or alliances with one another. Identity politics reinforces difference and exclusion, not inclusion or community orientation. More specifically, our criticism of what we're calling the fourth wave of feminism is that it's too reactive. If we are indeed in the fourth wave of feminism, we need to move towards a wave of feminism that is more intentional. We argue that the fourth wave as it currently stands is similar to the third wave in that it's too individualistic. We've taken our attention away from social structures that cause inequality and focus too narrowly on individual stories within. Furthermore, there are fourth wave campaigns like the Girl Up campaign that are steeped in neoliberal discourse that focus on pulling one's self up by the bootstraps. The idea of the selfie gaze is full of contradictions, as it inadvertently puts the focus on appearance and comparison culture. This is accentuated by social media that fourth wave feminists are relying on to thrust the movement forward. In the case of girl culture, the girl herself is expected to be an ideal neoliberal subject, empowered, agentic, entrepreneurial, and self-reliant. This mediated construction of the girl in post-humanitarian culture reinforces the inward gaze, where the attention is shifted away from political concern with global justice to a very individualized focus that is intertwined with entrepreneurial projects of the self. Essentially, we're encouraging young girls to work on themselves, implicitly implying that the self is somehow defunct or not good enough. The onus or attention is placed fully on the individual, and the action is meant to be individualistic as well. Through celebrating things like consumption, branding, self-gaze, and neoliberal values, the mediated girl in a post-feminist society masks rather than highlighting radical differences and inequality between girls, and totally disregards inequality, global justice, and exploitation more broadly. We need the fourth wave of feminism to be defined by the recognition and respect for differences. One thing I know for sure is that differences that divide us are not the problem, but the hierarchical ranking of those differences are problematic. If we are indeed in the fourth wave of feminism, then we need another wave. This wave is still too divisive. It emphasizes identity politics in an individual way, that reinforces gender inequality as well as some other forms of difference. This movement forward, in many ways, is just a reiteration of the past. It's a repeat of some of the mistakes that feminists have already made historically. We need to learn from the past and move forward with a commitment to intentional inclusion.
The fourth wave of feminism needs to include everyone, and that means men and women and people who are gender diverse, all people. We cannot have equality for all humanity without including people from across the spectrum of gender in the movement of feminism. We agree with advocates of the fourth wave of feminism that the common denominator in the fourth wave is inclusivity. Just not sure if we've reached that point. Feminism and the fight for equality in general can no longer be preserved for activists or intellectual theorists or academics. We need to shed the stigma and take it mainstream. We need to meet people where they're at, where they work, play, study, worship, hang out, live, and dwell, people from all walks of life. We need to make feminism more accessible and inclusive to people everywhere. True feminism is equality for all people. Fourth wave feminists need to recognize that true equality means looking at the ways that racism, gender discrimination, sexism, and climate change affect all humans. And when we think of gender equality, we think of women being disadvantaged. But fourth wave feminists are recognizing that men have also been disadvantaged by structures of capitalism, patriarchy, and gender ideologies that perpetrate toxic masculinities. And that gender diverse people who were never included in the equation continue to be marginalized. Many people argue that we're not likely to achieve equality anytime soon. We would argue that we're not likely to achieve equality so long as we continue to be divided on the basis of identity politics in a way that benefits and perpetuates capitalism by promoting materialism and consumer ideologies. We need to be critical. We need to understand that even our acts of resistance have been politicized. We need to know that even the act of resistance has become competitive and corporatized. There is a certain skill associated with resisting. To resist or to be an activist is to subject oneself to the new forms of disciplinary power.
How do we get feminism moving in a good direction or flow? Well, the late bell hooks argued that feminism is the movement to end sexism, sexual exploitation, and oppression. She was very clear. The problem is sexism. All of us, males, females, gender nonconforming people, have been socialized from birth to accept sexist thoughts and actions that impact us all negatively. We accept the ways that we're socialized to be masculine or feminine without question or criticism. To move forward towards equality, we need to replace sexism with feminism. What does it mean to be a real feminist? Well, bell hooks asks us not to water down the definition of feminism. She argues that to be a feminist, we need to create gender justice. We need to confront sexist thinking. We need to raise consciousness. We need to confront notions of internalized oppression. And we need a commitment to a feminist conversation. Jeff and I agree with bell hooks. We also know that according to Hooks, real feminism has lost its momentum. It has lost a clear definition. Bell hooks says, imagine living in a world where there is no domination, where males and females are not alike or equal, but there's a vision of mutuality. Feminism alone cannot create this world. We need to end racism and class bias and imperialism. However, feminism can make it possible to be a fully actualized male or female in a beloved community. In one of the most famous quotes in feminist scholarship, bell hooks says, "Come closer, and you will see that feminism is for everybody." We agree with bell hooks that the feminist movement has become too institutionalized and opportunistic. The jargon of feminism has been used to enhance class mobility for some women at the expense of others. We need to go back to the roots of feminism, which was about consciousness raising. We need to move beyond the construction of women as victim. Both men and women need to confront their internalizations of patriarchy and hierarchical ranking. In order to do this, we need to move towards a feminism that is intentionally more inclusive of all women, regardless of race, class, or ability, and inclusive of men and people who do not identify as male or female.
So what is stopping us? It's difficult to think of inviting men or gender diverse people to wade into the waters of feminism when women themselves are sometimes arguing about what feminism really is. It's also difficult to think of including all people when we look critically to see that both men and women themselves are active participants in perpetrating gender inequalities and binaries.
One of my favorite feminists by the name of Bart Key argues that women and men are active participants in their own disciplinary power to embody the characteristics of masculine and feminine. She also argues that knowledge or education is the most powerful tool of resistance. Another way of saying the same thing is that both men and women internalize their own oppression. We're not protesting the ways that we're socialized into roles that are masculine or feminine, or the ways that we ourselves reinforce these roles and ideologies in the dominant culture. Most people don't even question these ideas. In fact, not only do most people fail to question the social construction of masculine and feminine, many people believe that the qualities associated with male or female are biological, innate, or essential. Remember that word? We believe that this argument is highly political. If we convince people that the qualities associated with masculine and feminine are biological, then it's not a big leap to get them to believe that gender inequality is also natural and inevitable. So how do we move beyond these gender binaries? How do we move towards gender equality in these turbulent waters? For us, the answer lies in raising consciousness. And that begins with education and community engagement. We need a structure and a system where both men and women understand the complexities of the feminist movement, and that to be a true feminist is to promote equality for all people. Women cannot have freedom if men do not have freedom. All men cannot have true freedom if women do not have freedom. For absolute sure, gender diverse people cannot have true freedom until we move beyond these binary conceptualizations of gender to understand that the qualities that we assign to masculine and feminine are just human qualities. We teach young boys that they have to be tough and aggressive, and we tell them they're born that way. We teach young girls that their self-worth is wrapped up in their appearance or how they look. To really move forward, we need to understand that the ways that we construct both masculinity and femininity have dangerous implications for both men and women, boys and girls. Every one of us has a stake here. We need greater understanding of nonviolent, compassionate, non-judgmental communication. The key to human liberation lies in a shift in consciousness. It's difficult to see how we can include men when the women's movement itself has historically been so divisive. Let's be completely clear here. Black feminist theorists understood that white middle class and upper class women literally threw them under the bus. When privileged white women in the second wave of feminism were calling for equal access to work, this was racist. Why? Because underprivileged white women and racially diverse women were already working. A third of Canadian women were already in the workforce when upper class women were calling to be included. Privileged women didn't want to perform working class labor. Privileged women wanted jobs comparable to upper class men. The movement wasn't revolutionary, it was reformist, because they wanted to reform the system to have access to the privileges of white upper class men. However, working class women and racialized women have known all along that wages alone would not liberate them. Upper class women do not want to be like all men. They wanted to be like upper class men. Feminist efforts to grant women equality with men of their class neatly coincided with white supremacist capitalist patriarchy fears that white power would diminish if non-white people were gained power in the working world. All women were meant to see the economic gains of white middle-class women as positive signs for themselves. In this way, the mainstream feminist movement has been co-opted by white upper-class women, and the real, actual feminist movement has been left behind. For these reasons, bell hooks argued that the feminist movement was a hoax, that it colluded with capitalism. It was a hoax because privileged men never became equal caregivers or contributors to the household. The freedoms that upper class women wanted required the sustained subordination of working class and poor women. When some women gained access to greater status and power without conducting themselves differently from males, real feminist politics were left behind. It was as though white upper class women were added to the world of white upper class men, and this was meant to be equality for all people. Again, it was corrupt. White upper class women used racialized women to get ahead, just like white upper class men continue to use the labor of both working class women and men to maintain their positions of power today. This led to a major divide within the women's movement, and it reaffirmed some people's view that feminism was about sustaining capitalism, sexism, patriarchy, and white supremacy. It's no wonder not everyone wanted to be a feminist. Many women did not find work as meaningful as the feminist utopian suggested. When women work to consume more rather than to enhance the quality of their lives on all levels, work does not lead to economic self-sufficiency. More money does not necessarily mean more freedom or equality if that money is not used to facilitate overall well-being. Black feminist theorists have always been on point when they argue that income used to sustain patterns of materialism and consumption do not lead to more equality, but to less. When we look closely at the ways that the feminist movement has historically been misused to perpetuate some privileged women at the expense of others, we can better understand that not only did white women who look like me leave a lot of other women behind, but we never invited men. We didn't want them to be there. So how come men have never been included? Well, the question about why men were sporadically or selectively left behind or never fully invited to join the feminist movement sooner is a good one. And it's one that we need to address within the context of our presentation today. There are many really good and valid reasons that men were not initially invited to join the original feminist movement. In the beginning, women were fighting to be defined as persons. They were fighting for access to institutions that men already dominated. Then, in the second wave of feminism, some women fought to be treated on par with privileged men. In some ways, it makes complete sense that these waves of feminism did not include men. Women were still fighting to be considered. It was not acceptable to be gender diverse during these eras of our history, so gender diverse people were never included either. What is clear is that the women's movement did not include all women. Let's fast forward to the fourth wave of feminism, where the intention is to be more inclusive. If we truly want to move towards a form of feminism or a women's movement that is consciousness raising, where we can actually start to dissect the constructions of masculine and feminine, and where we can no longer understand them in binary opposition to one another, then we need a movement that's truly inclusive. We need a movement where all people come together to realize the extent to which the structures of inequality embedded in capitalism and neoliberalism and globalization are only working for a few people at the expense of the rest of us. We need to fully embrace what bell hooks told us many years ago. Feminism is for everybody. Every shape, every size, every color, every ability, every sex, every sexuality, every gender, every person.
So let's talk now about the temperature of the water for mainstream society regarding today's wave of feminism. Establishing desired emotional investment amongst men to wade into the waters has been difficult, partly because of the perception or reality of a lack of entry points. Thinking of the outsider perspective, seeing the fragmentation of progressive movements, it should be enough for a woman or gender diverse people to say, I need help, I am of value. For others, especially men, to want to take action. For the men that sincerely want to, the challenge is how to get into the waters. Now, growing up in a home of domestic violence, I saw a man who avoided taking ownership of his actions and who struggled to find a way forward due to the lack of emotional literacy to know how. Most of us are somewhere on the spectrum of having been disappointing, hurtful, or having caused harm. A number of men want to make amends for what they did or what they never did. For many men, however, the challenge is building the commitment, building the desire to even want to wade into the troubled waters. Having seen the challenges, tensions, and turmoil for women and others already in the water, it's not about watering down the issue, but finding comfort within the discomfort of the heated or frigid temperatures of these conversations in order to take those initial steps in. For women and gender diverse people we know and whom we love, but also for those that we don't know, as men, we must do our part. Love takes work. But when you don't know how to love in a way that heals versus dominates, or how to even do that work, it feels like those waters might drown you, or they're just too hot or too cold. So let's talk more about the perceived temperature of the waters. When it comes to conversations and work towards gender justice and equality, let's explore some of the tensions, perceptions, and misconceptions that we've already had that we have already alluded to regarding the water and today's wave of feminism across mainstream society. So much has surfaced from these accelerated times in the past 10 years, from Me Too, Time's Up, and the harm that women and gender diverse people continue to navigate to the Black Lives Matter movement. There have been waves upon waves of truth surfacing. Many truths have risen or floated to the surface of the water, truths that have long been dismissed or silenced, but can no longer be buried or submerged. We all need to realize these truths together. It cannot be some of us versus others of us. We need to raise our levels of consciousness together. Now, what's also surfaced is how we feel about it, our reaction to it all. We can lean forward, listening and wanting to know how we can help or make amends, or we can lean back in fear and shame, leading to defensiveness and denial. What has ultimately surfaced is our learned behavior, our cultural conditioning as a person or as a people. In some ways, we now see one another more clearly. We see who and what others value or devalue. We see who or what truths matter to each other. I think of Dr. Christine Blasey Ford's courageous and gut-wrenching 2008 testimony during the hearings in the US for the then nominee Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee. I remember staring at the faces of the old white men that made up the vast majority of the Senate Judiciary Committee and thinking to myself, each and every one of these men believed Dr. Ford and know Kavanaugh more than likely demonstrated harmful behavior and actions at the least. They just didn't care. They didn't care enough for their morality and ideas of accountability and justice to override their unbendable mission to stack the Supreme Court with specific conservative voices. I think the majority of men know what is true. It's a matter of caring enough. But the real truth is blaming men is just another way of continuing to divide us. We all need to be accountable. We live in a time of a massive empathy deficit. There is a massive empathy deficit, especially amongst men. And we think of solving issues like the gender wage gap and women achieving economic empowerment, or men being negatively impacted by a history of harmful ideas of manhood, toxic ideas of masculinity that teach them that to share their feelings or emotions is to be weak or feminine. Many things stand in the way. I think our empathy deficit in society is a key part of the problem. You know, we can tell men to use the right pronouns, to respect voices and contributions, and even the very lives of women and gender diverse people until we're blue in the face. And it feels like that we have been. But it feels futile when men aren't in a place to value or genuinely care. The temperature of the water needs to change for men to wade in and sit in these truths. The challenge to do that needs to be primarily on us as men. It's not about watering down the heat of these issues. It's on us to model what it is to wade into the discomfort and sit in the circle, to sit with the truth. This is how we can help lower the perceived and actual heat of the water. Awareness of statistics and data and figures and truths is one step. Moving men into a place of compassion, non-judgment, and true understanding is also important. But someone once anonymously said, compassion without action is just observation. Now, this is challenging, especially when we're taught that the characteristics of compassion and understanding are not to be associated with masculinity. The goal is to move beyond these simplistic categorizations to realize the real depth of human potential and characterization. I believe empathy is the bridge that moves us from compassion and awareness into action. Empathy is what bridges that gap, so we can get men on board with ending realities like the pay gap for women and social construction of violent masculinities as a cultural norm for themselves. Building bridges across these troubled waters, these seemingly vast oceans of difference between us, is a key. I believe that building bridges between us starts with building bridges within us. It starts with building connections between our head and our hearts. It begins with recognizing that empathy, emotional intelligence, compassion, being observant and reflective are not feminine traits, but human traits. Leadership traits that are just as essential, such as boldness and assertiveness, are also human traits or characteristics. We teach men that ruthlessness is a sign of masculinity or strength. Ruthlessness of men can equal to success in certain endeavors, but consistent ruthlessness and domination equals failure as a human being. It means falling short as a human being. We can ask ourselves regarding whatever space we work, live, study, worship, or play in, what kind of environment do we believe in, that we have here? What would women of color say about our environment? What would gender diverse people say about an experience interacting with us or entering the waters of our workplace, campus, or community? Going back to the third thing surfacing is the kind of action we take. After we react, how will we act? What will we do about it? We can become self-aware, collaborative, compassionate, and engaged global citizens in the service of others, service of one another, and service to change. Men's perception is a genuine feeling in some cases, and admittedly as a defensive act of denial, when they describe the waves of social change feeling like a threat that's crashing onto them, instead of feeling inclusivity as though they're becoming part of the wave. We need to have an honest talk around men's fear of the deep waters of the conversation. In the past, mistakes we have made, whether we're looking back to the hurt or harm men have caused, or the hurt or harm we've witnessed, or didn't stop and encounter as a bystander. We know that there's a history of hurt. We need to take on the fears of mentoring women in the workplace, our reactions to the Me Too movement, and conversations around cancel culture versus urgent conversations of men taking ownership, accountability, and responsibility.
Today, we're seeing what happens when people choose to avoid rather than face challenging truths and doing the inner work and collective work towards social change. The backlash from white men and some women of color to face hard truths about ourselves lead to some sliding back into the dark corners of the internet, the manosphere, to embrace voices that validate, coddle, or encourage them to blame others. These are dead ends for everyone. The truth is that we are seeing some women also retreat to outdated, regressive ideas of gender. In a time of uncertainty, some choose to return to familiar shores that are just islands society stays stranded on. People of all genders, of all walks of life, need to wade into the waters so that we can dismantle true systems and ideologies that leave us all stranded. The challenge is to somehow find the middle ground, meeting people halfway to have courageous but difficult conversations together.
What is important to bring home today is that when it comes to empathy, vulnerability, and accountability, the conversation needs to include people of all genders. These can be hard or difficult conversations to have publicly, but we need to find ways to talk about these things, to name and identify issues we discuss in private whispers. It's difficult to include all people in a conversation of equality when some people have more at stake than others. We often do not want to identify with the people who are in lower positions of the social stratification hierarchy, or see what we might have in common with other people, because we want to protect our own piece of the pie. If we want to solve the major dilemma of our times, if we want to progress towards a society that is really more equal, that we need to find a way to coming together, not despite our differences, but on the basis of them. We need to explore how to publicly model having these conversations while acknowledging navigating these tensions, treacherous waters, around tense subjects like identity politics and oppression Olympics getting in the way of aligning together power to the people and addressing the structures and inequality that impact us all. Another part of sailing forward in this turbulent waters is addressing what I call the trust famine. How creating an online and in-person culture of connection, community, and sense of belonging is key. But how do we do so while also acknowledging and navigating the needs of some women for safer spaces, excluding men? Many men are perpetrators or have been accomplices to patriarchy, having personal and collective histories of oppressing women and gender diverse people, or benefiting from it, looking the other way. How can men approach collaboration given the range of resistance to men's participation and partnership? Well, earning trust, repairing trust as men is a key part to the conversation as well. We need to insist that everyone, regardless of gender, sex, or sexuality, can be a feminist when we understand that true feminism is about achieving equality for all people. Conceding to truths doesn't have to be at the expense of larger issues, such as the misconceptions, the disinformation, the fears, as well as valid critiques of cancel culture, or the inclusion of men who also have experienced abuse, mostly at the hands of other men. This is critical in working on what stops men from getting in the water for this wave of feminism. It's critical to investigate and discuss the ongoing hesitancy to identify as a feminist that turns people off from investing in the self-work and community work. So here we are. This is a moment for us to determine who and what we value. A moment to overcome perceived obstacles and ride the wave in a good way together. To come to terms with who and what we've devalued. It's an urgent moment for us to bridge the divides and move together in a good direction. This is a moment in time where we can all step into the turbulent waters and change the tide of the direction of the flow of the water in a better and more progressive direction. So the third poll question we want to put out to you all is, how willing are you to step into these turbulent waters to do your part, to change your own narrative? Are you very willing, somewhat willing, or not willing? We'll take a look at some of those answers here.
Just at 50% now.
Okay, awesome. Well, maybe big drum roll. Maybe we'll let's see what the results are. Okay, 60% very willing, 36% somewhat willing, and 4% not willing. Thank you everyone for participating. Now to do this, to change the flow of the water into a better, more progressive direction, that means all of us as men, women, and gender diverse people embracing the impact we leave on others. We can't expect to achieve equality until we start to unpack the ways that our own action behaviors perpetrate the ideas of a gender dichotomy. In a relationship where one thing versus another, there is always a winner and a loser. When we understand gender and sexuality as dichotomies rather than fluid categories, we've been taught to see men or masculine as victorious at the expense of female or feminine. We would challenge you to think about whether everyone is actually really victorious in this kind of situation. It is a time of hard truths. We need to think about how these truths can define us as people and what we do about them. The moment of truth is surfacing. It's an opportunity for all of us, men, women, people who are gender diverse, to be the people we believe we are. The reality is today, headlines filled with stories of oppression, hard truths in our personal, professional lives can surface as we navigate the current, the flow of our everyday lives. Sometimes the water becomes turbulent. It's in moments like this when things are moving fast, where a sudden disturbance or occurrence in the water ahead can initially be read as a threat. The invitation that we learn how to face the hard truths together rather than as being divided. I want to acknowledge how many moments of truth like this, whether new to us or finally accepted, can make us as men shut down, tune out, and become fearful or defensive. The moment our raw reaction surfaces within our bodies and minds is an opportunity to consider the way we want to move forward. We can either propel ahead in denial defensiveness, or we can sit with what we're racing from facing. Now, if you're kayaking down a river and find yourself bearing down a rapid current, situations might slowly arise or suddenly show up in the water, which you might need to read as a threat to throw you off course. These are known as eddies. An eddy is a section in the river with a circular current, which comes about due to something obstructing the river's flow. So it could be like a fallen tree or a large rock that's fallen in the water. Water flows around the object, circles back, and then moves back into the flow. When you learn more about eddies and how to catch one, you realize they can offer a window of tranquility in the chaos. Just as when danger seems to appear in the waters ahead, a hard truth surfacing in our lives might send us into a panic mode. This happens when us as men, as a people, or as a nation, if you get to the core, this happens to us as men, as people, or as a nation. But if you get to the core of the eddy offers a moment of calm and clarity. It's a chance within the endless flow of life to gather yourself, regroup, and consider what's next. So we can consider an eddy in our life's journey as an unexpected opportunity to go from the panic zone into a learning zone. The key is handling the eddy lines. Now, the water moving around the object, the eddy lines, that water that whips around the object, sometimes causes a whirlpool, water swirling that could potentially drag things on the surface down underneath, possibly including you. Like anything in life, we need a moment of clarity by working through rocky discomfort while not letting it take us under. Your work, when you work your way through the eddy lines, through that discomfort, the turbulent waters, you have an opportunity to get into the center and get recentered. Like the waters of an eddy circling back, these surfacing hard truths provide a moment to bring us back to ourselves rather than continue to be disengaged. We can work our way through the eddy lines of fear and shame. Rather than letting us take us under emotionally, we can choose to wade into the emotional waters and face what we perceive as a hurt or a threat and dive into the emotional deep end to entangle and interrogate what we're actually feeling. It's easy to see ourselves, our reflections in still waters. In these eddy-like moments, we as men can stop and ask ourselves, is this hard or is it discomfort? Is someone actually shaming you or are you feeling shame? What do these notification-like feelings tell us? The eddy can offer a safer space to sort through these questions. Now, for many men, we are only okay with getting vulnerable if there isn't a sense of a threat, since our social conditioning makes us associate vulnerability itself as a threat, associating vulnerability with weakness. When we feel we're under threat or unsafe emotionally, it becomes hard to move forward. And we can allow ourselves to take a moment, take a deep breath. Staying stuck in guilt or shame won't help us, but we can be like water in the eddy, working through our feelings and getting back into the river's flow and heading in a good direction. We can align and realign our flow with our values, our integrity, and our principles. The eddies provide a moment to build our capacity, reconnect, restore our empathy, our own humanity, and then take the actions to restore the humanity of others. This is how we can truly move forward. This is what true justice and equality for all people looks like. This is what love looks like. Love means cleansing the heart of the hate that was shot into the currents of our veins, into the life stream. These moments of truth surfacing are an invitation to, instead of staying adrift, reflect, take accountability, and take action. Denial and defensiveness are the true obstacles in the river, heading to reconciliation and healing. The truth won't take us under, but our inaction will. The moment of a hard truth surfacing is an opportunity to be who we believe we are. We can decide to face our own resistance to the resistance efforts of any oppressed group and their struggles for freedom, justice, and their humanity. My longtime colleague and friend Tuval Dinanashi, who has been talking to men across Canada since 2004, said it best. We have a tendency in these moments to feel attacked and think about what's being taken from us. I invite myself and others to consider what is being gifted to us, the gift of accountability, the gift of growth, the gift of learning, the gift of righting what has been so wrong. Changing our relationship with the truth will change our relationship with the land and the people across the land for the better. The lessons from catching the eddies of life is that we as men want to learn to receive these moments of truth and move into them. It's no longer a perceived threat, but an opportunity to resist, transform, and grow. The reality is that it is easier to see ourselves clearly in the reflection of the still waters. Now, once you do the work, we can reapply that calmness into our life stream of consciousness. Read the bodies of water, read our own bodies, see the direction we've been going in. Let truth wash over you and renew a desire to take action. Let's reset, reflect, and redirect, and move forward in a good way. Let's catch those eddies throughout our life's journey. It's always a good time to change the direction of our story. Men need to overcome the perceived costs and embrace the potential costs for trying to be an ally to women and gender diverse people. There are conversations about what we should do, but then there are situations and conversations about what we must do. We must pick and choose which issues we personally are invested in, but we must all personally collectively be invested in working towards gender justice and change. The moment of a hard truth surfacing is an opportunity for men to be who we believe we are, to move from fearing the waters and the wave to riding the wave and embracing that we are the wave.
How do we ultimately achieve gender justice? How do we facilitate the well-being of both men and women? We must end sexism. Real feminism is the end of sexism for both men and women. Historically, Black feminist theorists have implicitly understood income earned from working will not lead to equality. We understand that gender inequality from a materialist perspective sees gender inequality, and I mean to emphasize here the unequal treatment of both men and women, serves the vested interest not only of people in positions of power, but to perpetuate the entire structure of capitalism. Capitalism is inequality. Karl Marx told us in the early 1900s that capitalism and equality are an oxymoron. They can't exist together. So we must all be on the same page here. So we must see that inequality is part of the structure of our society, that both men and women are disadvantaged. In fact, when inequality is understood from this perspective, we can see that upper class women have a lot more in common with upper class men than they do with lower class women. And the same is true for upper class men. What is relevant here is the material circumstances of those who are oppressed and exploited must change for us to have true equality, for us to move beyond the rhetoric of equality, equity, diversity, and inclusion. So we must ask ourselves tough questions. Are we willing to make sacrifices to change the overall structure of society? Are we willing to give up some of the privileges so that others can have more? These are questions that I've personally been grappling with for years. How can we make changes to our own individual lives that will have profound political impacts on society, that will lead to more positive social change at the social structural level? Are changes to our own individual behaviors enough? I used to believe that focusing on the self was too individualistic, but what I've learned is that we can focus on self with the intention to change the consciousness in a manner that is collective. We need to have a collective shift in consciousness, and that has to start somewhere. After all, the personal is political. We also need to see that at the systemic levels, governments and corporations can choose a violent, sexist, and racist economy where billionaires boom and billions of people are struck by the implications of inequality. Or they can choose an economy centered on equality where no one is forced to live in absolute poverty, and neither does anyone live with unimaginable wealth. We need to move towards a society where people have more than a chance to survive, they have an opportunity to thrive. So, can feminism include men and gender diverse people? Of course. Can anyone be a feminist? Yes, but wait, no. Not everyone can be a feminist because feminism is political. Feminism is anti-sexist. If you hold conservative ideologies and you want to perpetuate inequality, you are not a feminist. If you're a woman using class and race and power to dominate over other women, you're not a feminist. If you only want individualistic change for yourself, you're not a feminist. Ultimately, feminism is about shifting collective consciousness. It's about a new community orientation and community actions that are intentionally inclusive and critical of the structures of inequality. We cannot expect people to naturally be critical. Critical consciousness is something that we all need to model and we all need to teach. We need to move beyond internalized understandings of sexism and oppression. We need feminism to be community-based and education to raise critical consciousness. We need to reach communities beyond the academic realm, and we need to reach understandings of the real-life consequences of gender construction for everyone. So we'd like to ask you again, after you've heard most of our presentation, are you a feminist now? I'm interested to see if this has changed.
We just passed 50%.
Thanks, Linda. Okay, let's see what we've got. Okay, so 96% of people who are still on the call with us say that they are a feminist, and 4% still say no. Maybe we'll get to talk to those 4% at the end of our presentation. So to continue, an eddy is a good metaphor for life. After all, no one floats down the river like a riverboat fantasy. Everyone faces obstacles that disrupt the flow of life. There are many obstacles obstructing justice or equality for all people. The blunt truth, the hard truth, is that some people face more obstacles than others. As a white, cisgendered, heterosexual blonde woman, I face way less obstacles than my Indigenous friends or my husband's parents who immigrated to Canada from Jamaica in the 1970s. Historically, women have had to face more obstacles than men. Historically, some women have faced more obstacles than others. It may not occur to you at a glance, but I grew up in poverty, surrounded by alcohol and drug addiction. My passion for equality actually comes from my own personal experience of feeling exclusion and shame as a child. For some women, these obstacles continue to exist today. What I want to convince you is that there are obstacles for men too, and that the obstacles faced by white upper-class women who look like me are more similar to the obstacles faced by white upper-class men than the obstacles faced by someone at the bottom of the social stratification hierarchy, regardless of their gender. Jeff talked about an eddy as a place in the current where a person has an opportunity to shift or to change the direction or to pause. An eddy can be looked at as a learning opportunity. It's possible that some people who look like me haven't had much to learn about inequality. It's possible that those of us who faced less obstacles could continue along our merry way without looking back or analyzing why or how these eddies or obstacles are stopping others. Of course, we could do this, but the key to handling eddies lies in how you navigate or move around the objects. Objects in the way can cause a whirlpool effect, as Jeff told us. Has anyone ever tumbled in a giant wave? It's actually my very favorite feeling in the whole world. I love being completely ravaged by a wave. The thing is, this whirlpool effect or this swirling can drag some things below the surface to above. So when people face obstacles, whether the obstacle is racism, sexism, gender discrimination, ableism, or all of the above, it can drag them down. They may even lose a sense of themselves. But it is possible to wade through this uncomfortableness that ravages us and dive right in by facing or engaging the issue, by diving into uncomfortable conversations and difficult truths, by bringing to the surface our positions of privilege, and then being open to living in reciprocity with community, with ourselves, with others, and with our earth. Historically, feminism has told us that men and patriarchy are the obstacles. The reality is that patriarchy and capitalism aren't just the obstacles, they're in fact dams in the water. These dams actually block the entire flow of water so that no water can get through unless we dismantle the dam. We live in an era of surfacing, where on the surface, people no longer think that sexism or racism or discrimination in any form is okay. But these isms, these forms of discrimination continue to exist right below the surface. Difficult and hard truths are coming in waves. There are many waves coming forward that are rising to the surface of the water. These waves include movements that have been recent, like the Me Too movement or the Black Lives Matter movement. There are also, as Jeff alluded to, waves of reaction, how we feel about these inequalities coming to the surface. Some of us are able to lean in and want to make amends or wade into the waters. Others may dip their toes in the water and then want to react in shame. Others have a vested interest or stake in maintaining that dam. We need to assess the waves of action and decide how will we respond? What is it that we can do? Interestingly enough, if we're calling on a revolution to get rid of capitalism or patriarchy, to change the social structures and to dismantle the dam, then why have we spent so much time and attention in today's presentation around self-reflection? Well, the answer is simple. Because you cannot change what you don't know. And because all social structural change involves individuals who are willing to self-reflect, to change their consciousness and their own actions and their own behaviors. What happens when we start to take apart the dam? What happens when we start to see the role we might have played in helping to build the dam or secure the dam? What happens when we're called to check our own privilege? The same thing happens when you feel uncomfortable about the way your own actions have perpetuated the exploitation and oppressions of others. We ultimately have two choices. We can respond out of fear, or we can respond out of love. Regardless of your choice, your physiological response will be to fight, flight, or freeze. If you choose to fight, you will argue and you will deny. If you choose to flight, you may run away. If you choose to freeze or stop, it's possible that you pause long enough to change the cycle and move forward in a more vulnerable way. You have an opportunity to stop, to adjust, and to align your flow with the values of integrity. We can reconnect and we can restore our own empathy and humanity at the same time. We can restore the humanity of others as well. You see, it's a ripple effect. These moments of truth surfacing about the lack of inclusivity in the feminist movement are an invitation to make a different choice. Instead of staying adrift or floating on the surface of the waves, we invite you to dive in. We invite you to take action towards accountability. Denial, defensiveness, ignorance, and fear are the true obstacles in the water, leading to reconciliation, healing, justice, and equality for all people. I'll repeat what Jeff said earlier because it's worth repeating. As settlers, the truth won't take us under, but our inaction will. As humans who all share the power of water as a life source, we need to come together to understand the extent to which those dams or obstacles are impacting the flow of life for each and every one of us. We can decide to face our own resistance to the resistant efforts of oppressed groups in their struggle for freedom, justice, and humanity. When we do the work, it will have a ripple effect because we are the wave.
Yay,
Thank
we are the
you.
wave.
We are the wave. Thank
That
you,
was-
everyone. And we will now move to Danny.
Hey, that was so amazing. I'm just enthralled. So we now have the opportunity for everybody in the group to put some questions in the chat. And we can ask some questions of our amazing. Just find in the chat. I don't know what just happened to it.
Danny, I can see a question from Isadora.
Okay, go for it.
Okay, Jeff, I'll read the question. It says, if we were to create a new society or utopia from zero, what would a system where men and women and non-binary people who are equal look like? What are the main reforms that we would see?
Do you want me to, go for it?
Sure.
Yeah, I honestly, that sounds like heaven. That sounds like the goal, the ideal. What would it look like in everyday function? I think it's a lot of what we're talking about. I think in part, it's where certain traits, characteristics, tasks are not segregated or identified by a certain gender, that they're just human tasks, goals, traits, and things that we all take on together. And I think it's important to speak in that language of that's the goal, like that's where we want to go. We're not there yet. Like the challenge in these conversations is like, to dismantle the binary, we have to talk about the binary. In an educational sense, we have to discuss and acknowledge the binary is there, it exists. But then in talking about it and naming it, we can help dismantle it. It's like when you're a kid growing up, you learn names for things. You learn that, this thing is called a wall, and you walk up to it, you stumble and you touch it, you grab it, and then you learn that the wall is made of different things. Some are made of drywall, some are made of bricks, and how it's put together brick by brick. So when you learn to have a name for things and identify it, you can see it, So sometimes there are things in our lives where we learn the language, and that's through academia, through research, through everyday conversation with people, and we learn and identify and realize things that are in our lives. So it's kind of like learning to see the invisible, putting on, I describe it like your infrared invisible goggles to see the realities of what other people are going through. So we have to acknowledge and name those things in order to dismantle these challenges in our lives and these obstacles, the dams that are around us, the large structures. So yeah, that's my initial thought. I don't know if you want to add to that or move to the next question.
I want to just pick up on something that I saw in the chat box. I can't see whose name it was now. Oh, Jan. Jan says that invisibility can't be the solution. And I want you to know, Jan, that we would both agree with that Jeff and I would argue that we want to come together not despite our differences, but on the basis of our differences. So we would actually argue the opposite, that people don't need to be invisible, but what we need is for more people to collaborate, more people to come together in the way that we've tried to discuss and emulate in our presentation today. So I hope maybe that helps address that question, Jan.
And so we have another question. How does the fourth wave of feminism address ageism?
That's a really good question. So since Jeff answered the last question, I'll try to tackle this one. The fourth wave of feminism as it currently exists doesn't necessarily tackle ageism. What I think Jeff and I would say is the movement that we want to move towards in terms of what the wave of feminism should look like should include ageism. So we need to be we need to bring together women and men of all ages. It's never going to work if the conversations continue to occur only among certain ages of men and women. We need to encourage young people to come forward, and we need to bridge the divide between sort of more old school ideas of feminism and some of the newer, fresher, younger ideas.
Yeah, I would also say really quickly, like it's when we learn to value one another, I mean, that shows up in all different aspects of identity, like learning to just value and appreciate the perspective of elders, of people who've been there before us, and also those who are coming up who are just going through it. You know, like I learned so much from the youth I get to work with in conversations, and I'm always looking for the lesson, looking for the takeaway in any interaction with people of any age. Um, and yeah, I think that dismissing anybody is not helpful. It's embracing everyone's lived experiences and the learnings and the lessons, with gratitude. Yeah.
Thank you. Just to remind everybody, if you have a question, just throw it in the chat. And the next question is, what are your thoughts on abortion in terms of the feminist movement and in terms of sex-selective abortions that target girls because of their gender?
Jeff, do you want to tackle that one?
The first part, thoughts on abortion in terms of the feminist movement. I will say as a man striving to be an ally, I think, it's just without question, that for a woman, self-determination for their body, for people who are able to give birth, it's imperative, it's important for them to have that choice. And we're seeing the conversation right now. It's always been a divisive one. It's one that we've kind of avoided. I always love to quote Dr. Brene Brown. You can run from the story, but at some point you have to face it. Own the story, or the story will own you. And when you don't face these conversations, you end up running from them, and that kind of defines the narrative, defines the reality. So it's not to say that there are obviously people who've been fighting and working on this issue for many years, but I think there are a lot of people for whom they've just kind of ignored the topic or ignored the hard reality, because it is one of the most, we talk about turbulent waters, it's one of the waters are boiling hot when it comes to that conversation. So I think that, it's critical for us to find ways forward to have the discourse, and, but there's a non-negotiable for me, and that's that women have people who are able to give birth, people who have wombs, like, to me, it's non-negotiable that self-determination is key, and I'm 100% pro-choice. Amanda, you wanted to add to that?
I think I would echo what Jeff says here. A lot of the discussion that I can see in the chat box has to do with the history of feminism. And historically, one way that the feminism movement hasn't been so divided has been on the basis of abortion, because most feminists agree that both men and women and people who don't identify as a male or female should be able to have the right to control their own body. So the second part of the question is about abortions that target girls because of their gender. And this is something that we unfortunately see happening around the globe. This is one of the ways that I would argue that on a global perspective, there hasn't been the same convergence in the terms of gender equality that we've seen here in Canada. Another way of saying the same thing is that in Canada, we've sort of bridged the gap a little bit more than has happened in a global context. And the fact that in some countries around the world, they're still continuing to abort children on the basis of their gender is proof or evidence that from a global perspective, we haven't come as far as we might like to think.
Thank you. The next question is, how would you recommend that we go about conversations about new wave of feminism as a cis white individuals to avoid stepping on the toes of the true leaders of this movement?
I'll start by saying I think it's, as a lot of what we've talked about is finding the courage to step into these waters. It's not, I think one of the things is, one of the disservices we do is to say it's easy, it's simple. And on one hand, yes, it's on the surface, it's very simple. Be supportive, be someone who's an ally, be invested, like give a damn and care. But what that looks like in everyday life, like tangible examples, I think we need to have more and more of. Examples of what it looks like to do the unlearning, the listening, and trying to model that change. There are situations where, as a man of color, there are situations where there are only people present who are white. So it's on the people in that group to kind of show up. Like one of them can't say, hold on, I'm gonna go get Jeff. I'm gonna bring him here to the locker room or to the bar, and he's gonna explain a couple of things to you, And I think that while it's so important to recognize and acknowledge and support, for example, Black, Indigenous leaders and writers and scholars and academics and researchers and support them by purchasing their work or reading their work or sharing and showcasing their work. You know, when folks say, you know, go off and do your research, you know, I agree with that, but I also reckon, like, as a man of color, for example, I'm willing to meet you halfway and have the conversation with you when it comes to this intersection of race and gender, racism, you know, gender inequality, all forms of oppressive and transphobia, etc. I can show up as an ally, someone who's facing the harm, the discomfort, but, you know, I'm willing to meet you halfway and have the conversation, say, as a man of color, if you as a white person are going to meet me halfway with humility, accountability, and respect. Like, I think humility is such a big part of the conversation all around, you know, and I'm humbled and I have all the time in the world to have a conversation. Person is going to meet me halfway when with that kind of energy. So I think those are important things, because we need you to kind of, you know, we all need to carry this work forward. It's not about stepping on someone's toes or taking away spotlight. I think it's about, the phrase is signal boosting, right? It's kind of, how do we support the wave to become stronger, and those, finding the ways that we can do that. That's just part of the answer. It's not a simple wrap it up with a bow, but Amanda, please go ahead too.
I really like Isabel's question because it is part of the real dilemma of how we proceed. I think Isabel, it's possible, is a women's studies student, because one of the things that I know is that in women's studies, we tend to really shy away from conversations or discussions that don't validate sort of the historical work that's been done by women. So it's the kind of conversation that we're having today is a little bit frowned upon. And that is what makes me so happy that we're having the conversation. So I really want to say it's a great question. And I would argue that we don't necessarily need to step on the toes. We can acknowledge the work of the women that has led to the point that we are today in history without stepping on their toes. And we can use the work of the women that has already been brought forward to bring us to the point that we're at now. But we also need to recognize that we can't keep dwelling. We need to move forward in a way that makes space to elevate the voices of racialized and gender diverse people. And we also need to move forward in a way that's inclusive intentionally. And while we want to revere all the things that the historical women's movement has done for women, there were mistakes made in the women's movement, and we need to acknowledge those mistakes and move forward in a way that is better and, in my opinion, more inclusive.
Thank you. I would like to put back on the table just having Jeff come talk to all our friends, though. I'm not sure. You know, you just took that right away. The next question is, do you think that perhaps to make great change, we should start with education? Maybe adding education around feminism to our school curriculums. High school? Public school? I added the public school part. Amanda, we'll start with you, seeming literally this is what you do.
Yeah, so I love that you asked the question. I think it's Isadora, because this is what I have been doing for the last 20 years as an educator, is bringing these conversations to my students. I have lots of students on the call today, so thank you to my students who showed up for me. I really appreciate it. But I absolutely think that we should be making changes to education so that the types of conversation that we're having today about challenging the structures of inequality that are embedded in our very structure of education are conversations that are routine, that aren't just happening in some classes, but are happening in all classes. And of course, I wish they were happening at the primary school level and at the high school level. To me, it's important that people become good humans. And how do you become a good human? Well, we talked about a lot in our presentation about how you can't do better until you know better. So I believe that the shift in consciousness that we're talking about, that is the real work of feminism, has to change. And one of the best ways that we can do that is through the model of education.
I'll just add really quickly to that too. You know, one of the things I tell people, because people will look at, you know, when I'm having conversations with men, and you know, I say to them that you don't have to make this your life's work. Like, you know, I've chosen to make this something that I do as a career. But you can, so you don't have to make this your life's work, but you work towards change throughout your life. So these conversations can happen not just in places of learning where they should, but also places where we work, study, hang out, the places you hang out. And it doesn't have to be heavy or cumbersome. It's just encouraging, finding ways to kind of bring along these conversations in those spaces. It could be like starting a book club. It could just be just having casual conversations, or putting on the table as something we need to talk about as an organization, as a team, as a collective. The learning can happen everywhere and at any different stage of the life cycle. And I think that approach of us being students of life, I think, is so important, part of that ongoing learning. And that's the humility that allows you to keep doing that learning as well.
Thank you. So there's a question that I'm not sure I can pronounce, but I'm going to try. That hegemony forces the patriarchy to exercise strong dominance over women in all the institutions of society, family, school, employment, etc. What is the best way to approach this problem from the male point of view, especially from the point of sexist men?
Oh, I'm just looking for that question in the chat so I can read it over. Oh, sorry.
It's from Catalina,
Oh,
and she's
Catalina.
asking about the hegemonic forces of patriarchy. I think you should answer this question because this is your jam, Jeff.
Yeah. I found it now.
Okay, well, Jeff's finding the question. I'm going to give my answer.
Yeah,
Catalina.
just really quickly.
Okay, I'll just be quick. Thanks for asking the question. I believe that we have to all work together. So for me, it's that change in, or the shift in the level of consciousness. And if we all start to unpack the social constructions of masculinity and femininity and understand the extent to which they're all dangerous for both men and women, then this is a really good place to start. And we need men who are similar to Jeff, who are modeling this kind of behavior for other young men and boys, because people who are in academic realms or people who look like me, it's tough for especially young men and boys to take the kinds of things or messages that I'm saying seriously. So I think we really need to push to change that awareness or consciousness among men and boys who will then model and emulate those new ideas for others. What are your thoughts, Jeff?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that it's again recognizing that it's not an easy conversation. If we're talking about trying to find a way forward with a man who's holding sexist, misogynist views, I think that just the very tension of the conversation. We talk about the temperature of the water. Another way to think of it is like it's kind of like gardening. Like for me, like if I want to plant a seed with them, because it might not be that I'll have a conversation with them that will change their mind. But the idea is to plant a seed that will at some point hopefully bloom and catch and start to grow in their minds. And that might not be me, it might be someone else who says it, like a friend or someone that they respect or they feel more comfortable with. But you think of it like throwing a seed onto dry soil, right? Like the seed will just stand there on the soil, it won't fall in and take root. Like the challenge is nurturing the soil so that it allows the seed to kind of take root, that understanding, that wisdom. And it just takes a moment, unfortunately. Like it's not something we can just kind of just convince someone right away. It should be enough to say that this is a reality, we need to do something about it, you need to be invested. But it requires that investment on the person's behalf and developing, how I describe it, like an empathy muscle that's become atrophied for so many of us as men, that emotional muscle. And to me, that's the kind of like pre-work that we need to do as men, with men, amongst men. I would say that that's kind of my duty as a man who's trying to be an ally, a man who is trying to support with this conversation, is to kind of create the environment and do the work so that this person will eventually take that understanding, take that perspective and see what's going on and want to slowly invest in change and doing the work. The ongoing work, but that's the part of it is creating the commitment and the investment, and making them to want to do that work.
That's awesome. Thank you. So this question is for you, Jeff. What are the first 3 steps you would recommend for men to wade into the water of feminism?
Well, the way I describe a simple analogy that I think men can remember, it's I see you, I feel you, I got you. It's a simple phrase, sorry, 3-step. I see you, I feel you, I got you. And I see you is the awareness and the compassion piece. Like it's awareness of statistics, hearing the stories, hearing what's happening for example, Muslim women, for Indigenous women, seeing the statistics and then saying to yourself, that's horrible, that's terrible. That's not good. Like if, for example, take a random field like engineering, knowing what women are facing in the field, that there are so few women enrolled in engineering programs and the challenge of maintaining or staying in that career and that field. So that's the compassion and awareness. But then moving into the empathy piece, from I see you to I feel you, is I feel you. Like I feel what that's like. Like I understand how that makes you feel excluded. Like you don't want to be involved. How that just eats away at you and it destroys the passion you had for the work, and it makes you just want to switch gears and leave the field, or just it's overwhelming to try to kind of have to be twice as good as everyone. And that helps you move into I got you, which is the action piece. That with all those things in place, now I can take an action. I'm invested and I want to take an action to do something about it. I think that's critical. It's finding your own way to take an action. We can all do something. We have all a unique role we can play and contribution to the larger effort. It's about thinking about what does that contribution look like? Like, what do I need to do? What can I do? Because we can always say there's something you can do. There's an action that you can take. So again, I see you, I feel you, I got you, I think is a way forward for men.
Awesome. Okay, so our next question. How do you identify Islamic feminism? Some said, as Margaret Badaran, a feminist writer, there's Islamic feminism, which is work in the Middle East, but others refuse the connection between Islam and even in your question about kinds of feminism, I didn't see Islamic feminism. Another question is why you focused on feminism as a social structure, but not focusing on it as an international school of thought in the IR. I means as a political movement.
Okay, Sheila, I can see your question and I want to thank you for asking it. I guess I would have a couple of responses to that. So there were also another number of types of feminism that we didn't bring up, and that was really because we were hoping to move through the presentation and still have questions. Like, for example, we didn't discuss lesbian feminism either. So I know that there are many different types of feminism that weren't discussed. I tried to highlight the most popular types of feminism in the Canadian context in the second wave. So I do apologize for the oversight. I think that what both Jeff and I would agree on is that we would want to move towards a feminism that is inclusive, and being inclusive includes different types of nationalities, ethnicities, and religions. So we believe that we have to move towards inclusivity, and that's challenging everyone to have difficult discourse and conversation, uncomfortable conversation, to wade into waters that we've talked about as treacherous. And the example you give here is of Islamic feminism and pushing us to focus on international schools of thought is a good suggestion, because one of the things that I would say is that from my perspective, I believe that feminism has to stay political. I think that we have to move towards a feminism that understands that we can never truly have equality for all people unless we continue to understand how the structures of equality continue to benefit people in positions of power. So while it's so important to bring into the view or the lens people who are on the periphery or edge or marginalized and who have been marginalized for a long time, we also have to move forward in a way that is political, because we want to always be critical of a system or structure of inequality that continues to benefit few at the expense of many. So I would say that if we're looking at feminism from an international lens, that's the lens that we need to be taking, because when we talked at the beginning of the presentation about what was happening in terms of the global perspective of feminism, I think your question about Islamic feminism would be well put in that perspective, or well placed in that perspective. Jeff, your thoughts?
Oh, I think you covered that well. I think it's, part of the challenge around taking on Islamophobia is it's important to recognize that that's our collective work, that we should all find our own ways to support that effort and do that work. While we absolutely want Muslim voices to be at the forefront in talking about what they need, how we can help dismantle this unique form of prejudice and discrimination, harassment, and violence, it's not all on them. Like it's not their work. They're left to it. We need to find ways to support and contribute to the struggles, the change or the solution to the challenges and the issues and the struggles that people are facing across the board. It's, again, these are nuanced conversations, and trying to say that there's a simple solution, that these things are not easy, it's not helpful. And I think it's moving forward, I think we need to try to have these more complicated conversations together. Yeah, find ways forward. So
Thank you. So we have 6 minutes left. So I'm going to ask one last question and then ask for your final thoughts. So raising consciousness among parents about the social constructions, in my view, is another important area. Are there any suggestions on how to do this?
I think that's a great question. It's something that I actively try to model in my own life. I gather my sons and my sons' friends as often as I can, and I teach them about principles of equality and feminism, and I'm constantly in their ear, and they don't necessarily, like Jeff said, I'm just planting seeds. They don't necessarily agree with or even respect all the things that I'm saying, but I say them anyways. And the same is true for my daughter. I'm constantly telling her or talking to her about ideas and deconstructing what it means to be masculine or feminine. And we have to understand, not everyone has the same toolkit that Jeff and I have. And so it's about really opening up the conversation to be more accessible so that people who are parents can have access to the kind of information that we've shared in today's presentation and can move forward in a way that's more intentional and more inclusive as parents themselves.
Yeah, I think about how, as parents, and I think of men who become parents to daughters, there's, sometimes on one hand, it does frustrate me that, it's not until a man becomes a father and realizes, that they have a young girl, and now they're invested in these conversations, right? It's not until it becomes their property or someone that a possessive, like my wife, my daughter, my kids, etc., right? But I also acknowledge that it is a way in. That's a way that is an in. So being thankful for the opportunity that, okay, well, now that you're here, let's have that conversation. Let's talk about it. But I think it's also recognizing that, and I'll speak to, again, as men, that we need to be invested in this conversation. So it's not just about, thinking about for the sake of my child, but the kind of impact I want them to have in the world. So if you're raising a son, it's thinking about the kind of son you want to have and the impact you want to have them to have in the world, not just what they face or go through and protecting them from accountability. It's about sometimes that part of this is your child recognizing, your son recognizing, these are the realities. And if you identify as a young man in this world, here are the unearned advantages and the privileges, and here's what you can do about that. And modeling it, I think it's, if you want better for your child, you need to model the thing that you want them to be. And it's not just the things you say, it's the things you don't say. It's the things you don't do, the conversations you don't show up for, that speak volumes. And again, it's not easy. I'm not a parent. I was a guardian. My partner of 7 years had 2 girls. I'm very thankful for those 7 years of learning and experiences. And I have so much respect and appreciation for how it's the greatest task, the greatest thing you could do in your life is to raise a child. There is nothing like that. And I think it's rising to that occasion and recognizing that if I want this child to recognize humanity and to have their humanity embraced, I have to model it. That means, recognizing the humanity within myself and building those bridges within me. Wanting more for your child means how they contribute to the world as well.
So I guess that's it. Any last thoughts, Amanda or Jeff?
I would just like to say thank you. I would like to say thank you again to everyone who came. Thank you to Danny and Linda at the Gender Equality Coalition. Thank you to the United Nations for hosting this event. Thank you to my family for putting up with me while I created this presentation. And thank you mostly to Jeff. Jeff has been an amazing partner. I've really enjoyed working with him to create this presentation, and I hope we have an opportunity to work with each other again in the future. We really have come together to model that level of collaboration and community activism that we hope to aspire you to achieve. So thank you so much for supporting us and for attending our presentation today. We really appreciate it. If you're interested in having further conversation with us, I posted the link. We'd really be happy for you to join the Gender Equality Coalition of Ontario, and you will be able to see a copy or a recording of this presentation there. So I will end by saying, in gratitude, thank you.
And everybody should wade into the water.
Yes. Yes, yeah. And let me just say really briefly, just thank you to Dr. Amanda and to the whole Gender Equity Coalition team for all your work and for making this conversation happen, and for everyone attending. I'm going through a bit of a health situation here, so I'm just thank you so much to everyone for your investment in this conversation. And this is an important discourse, and I'm glad that we're here for it, and hopefully the beginning of a conversation that we continue. So thank you. Yay. Thank you, everybody.
So we'll just say good night and good afternoon and good evening to everyone on the call. And that is the end of our session for today. Thank you so much for attending.